This is my video about a beginner's first build of a Dynam Waco aircraft. I'm going to cover a number of different points about Dynam in general and this plane specifically, but I'm going to start off with, as a beginner, and I'm a raw beginner, I want to dispel any reluctance you might have to take on a project like this, because I can assure you, you can do this. Now, my first plane, and first and only plane, was this Cub S, which is a very fine little model. Believe it or not, this little sucker here only weighs about 2 ounces. It's got a 20-inch wingspan. It's got all kinds of top-notch technology. It includes SAFE and AS3X. So given, and also with the top wing configuration, you really have a nice stable platform that you can fly with and learn to fly fairly easily. Now in my case, I still have been crashing this plane about 60% of the time, and mostly due to one principal error. And that is, I don't do a good job of thinking out things beforehand in terms of where to fly and when to fly. You need a huge open space. No poles, no furniture, no houses, no mailboxes, none of that. You need a soccer field. And you need to go out on a day where there is like no wind, because this guy is so light and twitchy that the wind, anything over a breath of wind, you're going to be in some bit of a difficulty to control this guy. All that said, I've crashed this guy so many times, and he's still flyable. I mean, you just tape up these things. I've hit a house. I've been in a tree 3 times. I mean, I've done everything wrong that you could possibly do at least once. So this poor little guy here has seen me through at least my initial learning phase. I doubt if I have the ability really to go to this as my second plane. I probably should have just bought another S Cub and beat it to death before I went on, but I'm dumb. And this plane is only this plane was only $205, including shipping, and I thought, you know, what the heck. Now, before I get too far with this, Dynam caught a ration of crap from a lot of people's reviews about the quality of the airplane. And I didn't find that to be the case at all. Now, yes, the instructions suck, so thanks to the Petronish brothers in Slovenia with their very funny and very informative videos, as well as this gentleman here. I watched his video, this particular video and its companions, at least a dozen times while my plane was on order, to just try and educate myself to what I was really getting into. But I'm glad I did this. Even if I wind up crashing this thing the first time up, you know, there's a learning curve to all this. So a little bit about Dynam quality. Yes, they do have some issues. A lot of reviews complained about rudders that were bent over like an orca's tail, and elevator surfaces that were just screwed up, and wings and all kinds of stuff. Well, I suspect that, number one, this plane came out in 2012 and it is now 2020, just about Christmas, so it's about to go to 2021. I think I may have gotten a later model here, because some of the comments included that the landing lights were red instead of white, and you know, why would anybody get that big out of sorts about something like that? But in any case, this plane doesn't look like that, so I'm assuming maybe this guy is a little later model, and maybe they changed the packaging up a little bit, and when it went through the shipment process and the warehousing process, it wasn't subject to any kind of high temperature that might lead to warpage. I know that you can reform some of these parts by immersing them in hot water and then letting them cool off, and they kind of pop back to where they were. Haven't had to do that yet, so you know, I don't know if that's actually true. But this is my plane. It took me roughly 4 days to build, and part of the reason why is that I like the satin finish of the plane. I think it's an attractive surface. It doesn't reflect as much when you're flying it, so I think you get a better sense of the surfaces that you're looking at. I have a lot of problems at my early experience with orientation. I really easily lose where my controls are 180 degrees out of what I think they should be. I'm still at that phase. So yes, this plane is not long to live, but maybe not. In any case, one of the reasons it took me so long to build this plane is that I sprayed all of the surfaces before assembly with this stuff right here. This polyurethane, water-based polyurethane spray. It comes out pretty well. It's very thin. It adds a layer of toughness to the plane that allows you to paint the plane afterwards, because sometimes when you try and paint a foamie with the wrong paint, and a lot of the paint is wrong, it melts the foam, and you don't want to do that. That'll ruin your day. So in any case, this stuff works, and it works great, but it also solved a major issue that I've had with builds that I've seen online, and that is that, you know, people build this plane and the surface has this nice satin finish to it, but the decals are glossy and it looks really ghetto. I mean, come on, fellas, fix that. So what I did in this case was I learned from these other videos that you put the decals on first. So in this case, let's talk a little bit about this long decal here. Number one, notice that the bottom bar fits right in the corner. Now, my lighting in here is terrible, but the top bar on the right side of the plane has to line up with a push rod that goes right there. So cut a slot in the decal. When you lay it down, wrap it around that push rod, and it'll work out just fine. Then, going from the back to the front, let the decal in the front land about an eighth to a quarter of an inch from that point there, and that's the lineup that really is what the plane should look like. Now these things down here, believe it or not, they actually orient from tip to tip. So when the plane is sitting on the ground, they're not at the same angle as the above decal, but that's the way it's supposed to look. Now, let's see. Let's talk a little bit about some of the issues that I have. Number one, for God's sakes, fellas, put a pilot in your plane. You know, flying a plane around with no pilot, it don't look right. I think that adds to the number of crashes. This particular pilot came from Hobby King. It was $4.04. You can spend $20 finding a pilot with this level of quality. I mean, look at that. Got little rosy cheeks. He's got color on his lips. I mean, this is a nice looking pilot. Now, unfortunately, this plane is actually, its scale is 1 to 7, and a little bit more than 1 to 7, and that pilot is a 1 to 6, so he's actually a little bit too big for the plane. Ideally, what you want is a shoulder width of 55 millimeters, but I took this guy and I cut off the bottom 3/16 of his torso and then sanded him and glued him in place, and he looks believable. I mean, he's maybe just a big guy in a plane, you know? So that's the best looking pilot that I was able to find. I wanted to actually put an R2-D2 model back there, and I did eventually find one, but it was $8 and I already had this pilot, and that's the way that story went. Now, as far as the fit and finish of Dynam planes, okay, it's rare for this paint line to line up. It just doesn't happen. So what I wound up doing was I took, you can only do this if you varnish the plane, okay? The surface of the plane has to be tough enough to withstand what I'm about to show you. But basically I took this sorry about all this. This Scotch tape here, it's a vinyl tape, but it's a fairly low stick tape. And I took a piece of it off and then stuck it to my shirt a number of times until it lost its real adhesion. And then I put it on a piece of paper where there's just a thin strip of it. Okay, you can see that there. Now, when you push this down on the surface of the model, you can just finger tack it and then push it over one more time. And you've got a pretty decent adhesion, but it's only over a very small surface. And you should, given the fact that it already has 2 coats of the varnish on it, you should be able to do this and not tear the paint on the plane. And also, it helps to spray your paint this direction so it doesn't get under the tape. Now, I did that on this side of the plane. My body fit had a crack running down through there, so I took some of that flexible, lightweight spackling compound, filled it in, and then painted it. And I got the lineup of the paint to match simply by using that piece of paper, because it's you know, you ain't gonna do it by hand, you know, it never works out. And the same with this. Basically what I did was I put that down there, and you can see how much cleaner that line is over there than it kind of got over here. It's due to that. Now the other thing, another pet peeve, with these planes, the light's going to be a little too bright really to see it. How about here? Yeah, same thing. Maybe between the blanks you can see what I'm saying, but in the plastic surface cover, you can see glue and all kinds of stuff in there. So take some flat black paint and paint that. And when you put your varnish over it, the flat black will match up to all the rest of the surface. Now, this guy is even uglier. He's got about a 3/8 of an inch tab running all the way around and underneath that you really need to paint black for it to look halfway decent. Otherwise, you got another ghetto component on your otherwise really pretty plane. Which brings us to, I guess, the hatch at this point. You know, you have an option when you're building the plane as to whether or not you want to have lights on it. And, you know, there's no effort to it. Just put the wires in there and wire up your plane, because, you know, sooner or later you're going to be flying your plane and trying to get the last light of the day. And boy, you know, I'm betting that those lights, seeing those lights when that plane is flying around doing a low flyby is going to just really make my day. So do the lights. Now, the hatch has some issues. People complain that the hatch magnets don't sit down very well, and they don't. You have to raise them just a little bit to make it work. And the other thing is that once the magnets really are working, it's kind of hard to get that little sucker out of there. So what you have to do is, rather than smash these points down, trying to pull that hatch back, and you can't really reach back there and use the windshield to get this thing out. So what I did was I used those little flexible aluminum adhesive strips that go in a COVID mask to help it wrap around your nose. God, I hope this, by the time you see this video, all that crap's over with. I put these tabs in here this way, and I took it from the hint of the guy that I just showed on my monitor. Basically, he cut a slot in that face of his hatch, and I stuffed these, you can't really see them very well, but I stuffed and glued in 2 of these long aluminum things. So you got one end here and the other end coming out of there, and then I painted them. Now, one of the Dynam issues is that not only these pants down here, but also the front cowl are painted yellow, and they vary a lot. In my case, this cowl is like almost brown. And there were variances in this pant here that were kind of sketchy too, that don't really show up in this video because of the general overall lighting. But you're going to need to paint these guys and this thing. It bugged me that the front cowl was yellow and the backside was black. You know, why aren't they both black? So I painted mine black, and I painted the rest of the yellow area up here, this flat black. In retrospect, when I eventually did find what the correct yellow is, which we will now take a side tour for that, is this stuff right here. Okay, this is the, I mean, I've tried all kinds of available, come on, focus, yellows, to finally settle on this one as being the actual right color. It is Tamiya Chrome Yellow, okay? You can get it at your hobby store. Now back to the hatch. Here are the magnets. They need to be raised just a skosh to get good contact. That's easily done. You just either use your fingernails or a small, very small standard screwdriver and kind of pop them up and then glue them back down where they're level flat. You can do that by pushing them in where the glue is still wet, turning the whole apparatus upside down and smashing it on your table. Now they're flush. Now, one issue that a lot of people had with Dynam planes is ventilation. And I saw in a video how this one guy with a red plane simply cut a hole in his forward part of his hatch because it's actually thinner right there. In my case, I decided to cut from this starting point here, and that sort of limited the distance that I could actually cut. But I dug that long slot, and then I needed some kind of cover to, you know, make it look a little more aesthetically pleasing. And what I did for that is I got none other than a big fat Sharpie. And I took the top and cutting off the part of the top that has the clip on it, I angle cut from that end there to about here, okay, with a pair of just big scissor, like tin snips, kind of like things. Now the plastic has a tendency to crack, so you got to be careful and go slowly with it. But you can make that cut, and then I took it and held it and just sanded it down until it had the appearance that you see on this thing now. And that resolved at least the forward electronics ventilation. Now the next problem with the ventilation area that you have to resolve is the engine compartment. In this case, you really need air to make it back through here to where the ESC is. It runs all the way back into the aircraft. In this lighting, you really cannot see it. By the way, those valve or oil guides, I just painted silver with a paint pencil. Now, this cowl back here is a very thin vacuum formed plastic piece, and it's easy to cut, and it's easy to cut badly. So you need a very sharp X-Acto knife, and you simply cut along the edges of the, can I get that? You know, cut around this space here, and the same on, I went all the way up horizontal on both sides. And then I painted the bulkhead behind black so that you really would have a harder time seeing that. Now, you'll also notice that if you look carefully that there is a gap between the fake engine and the front of the cowl, okay? And behind that, there is also an additional little airspace so that air gets back behind all of this stuff and can get to the motor as well as it gets through the motor to the motor through this forward opening. Now, one issue that I have at least seen in videos and is that sometimes the cowl can touch the motor or the propeller, okay? And that's simply because the cowl is too far forward. It is held on by magnets, and with relative ease, you don't have to wrench this thing at all. you can move it forward or backwards to make sure that it is not rubbing, because it principally rubs right here, because right after this kind of bushing thing here, the motor gets bigger. And if that's far enough back, it'll easily touch that surface. Now, I suspect that engine can be put a little too far forward, really. You know, and it only takes a millimeter to get it to where it actually touches the motor. So it's a precise placement that you know, in my case, everything is okay, but that's going to be your issues. That's my guess. So let's see, that's the hatch, that's the forward ventilation. Let me talk a little bit about something that I saw in a lot of the maiden flight videos, and that is the suspension and the wheels that are on these planes. Number one, they are extremely hard, super lightweight wheels. And I've seen guys in their videos and their first landings kind of hit, maybe, you know, I mean, you have to have some speed to keep 3.5 pounds up in the air. So when it comes down, they touch down a little too hard maybe, and it really bounces. So, and I attribute some of that at least to the tires. So I swapped out my tires with some low bounce tires. And the low bounce tires that I used are none other than Dubro low bounce. Now, the size that fits this airplane are 2 3/4 inch diameter. Okay, they match up the size of your existing wheel. Now, the wheel that you're going to see here is a 2.5, because I'm trying to save you 2 trips to the store. You don't need the 2.5, you need 2 3/4. But here's how it works. These little screw points right here, you take the 4 screws out of there, and when you do, you can simply pry open the pant. Nothing to it. But you're going to notice that the axle itself has, there it is, has threads. And those threads kind of bind against the wheel that you put in there. So I resolved to try and do something about that, particularly when I discovered that the diameter of the hole in those wheels is considerably bigger than the OEM. So what I did there was I took this coffee stirring rod from Starbucks and cut a section off of that, which I then used to, and doing shaky hands and video at the same time is one difficult process. Anyway, it goes on like that. Okay, now by the time you mount the tire on there, everything, come on, get on there. What did I do wrong here? Okay, there you go. Now you have like an additional bearing, so to speak, that this thing can really rotate easily on. Okay, now the next step you have to do is you have to cut, hey, stop that. You gotta cut that little post in half, okay? Because this tire is wider than the OEM. And once you do that, that pant will go back together easily. It snaps back together, it screws back together very simply. Again, it's plastic. Don't drive those screws in too hard. And it sits up snugly and it works great. So that's how I handled what I thought was going to be a suspension problem. In the meantime, I'm gassing myself out here with this Sharpie. So hold on a second and get that covered up. Okay. Now, one of the problems that they don't talk about in the assembly is the servos. If you want to get the most accurate control surfaces before you're on the field, you need to make sure that that arm, the attachment arm on the servo is at 90 degrees, okay? So as you build, pay very careful attention to where that where those pieces attach to the servo. In this case, I'm talking about that little white guy right there. You know, he needs to be at, it doesn't really look like unless I get the right angle, but you see he's like 90 degrees to the wing surface, and you need to make sure that that is what's happening to the servos inside the plane as well. It's got to be at 90 degrees or you're going to have some error to one side or the other in terms of being able to get a perfectly functioning control surface. And it may force you to do all kinds of unnecessary clevis adjustment. In my case, this was my first build, and I really didn't know how to accomplish that. So what I did was I had to take a ruler to run against my wing surface to make sure that the pieces were flat. Okay, same, I mean, all of them. So once I had them perfectly set up, and I had to do a lot of clevis adjustment to make that happen. And oh, I just remembered a very important safety point. When you spray varnish this part of the plane, there are some push rods right there. Now you have to mask off the threaded part of those push rods or you'll get spray on there, and then when you go to adjust your clevises, guess what? It gets really difficult. It gets so difficult that I suspect that I came close to the fatigue point of the clevis itself. But nobody broke, so hopefully I'm good. Speaking of clevises, I used some what amounts to white duct tape to close off my clevises to make sure that they don't come apart later on in flight. You know, nobody needs that. It's going to make for a bad day, even when I'm doing the very best I can to keep it in the air. Now, we'll talk a little bit about one Dynam construction issue. Is almost invariably the way the wings go together, you wind up with a kind of an ugly seam. And in my case, I just used some black Gorilla duct tape and wound up gluing it there and then coming back with some spray to give it the same sheen as the rest of the surface has. I think I talked about painting around the lights already. I hope so. In any case, around, I better double check. But around the lights there are, you can see a certain amount of glue and nonsense because it's a clear cover. If you come back and paint that with some flat black and then varnish over it, you wind up with a pretty nice look on, see, in between blinks you can see that, you know, if you could see the glue around there, it would have been, you know, not nice. So also let's talk a little bit about my propeller. I went with a master air screw 12x6 prop, and I did so primarily because I thought that the Dynam prop really didn't have the same kind of scale appearance. It's got this, you know, weird gink in the middle, and the tips are kind of tapered off oddly instead of squared off, and you know, there's a lot of thick to thin going on here, which I didn't really care for. And the other complaint from a lot of people was that Dynam's props are not balanced, which I finally realized was the case simply by putting my prop on a wait, where are we? Okay, putting my prop on an axle and finding that sure enough, one blade is invariably heavier than the other. Now, I have seen people in their videos talk about putting a piece of electrical tape on one blade, on the back side of one blade to balance their prop, but I suspect that there's actually there's an easier, less ghetto way of doing that, and that is principally that you'll notice on the back side of the prop, there's these, you know, there's these little kind of holes. And I suspect that if I just cut off a couple of pieces of soldering wire and put them in there, I could quickly discover whether or not I could get it balanced and then maybe glue them in place. But even if you don't glue them in place, by the time you mount the prop, when it snugs up to the armature right here. You know, ain't nothing getting out the back of that thing. So that's so much for the prop. You know, is that everything? Let's see. Seems like there's something else. Let's see. Pilot, low bounce wheel, lighting. Yeah, that's pretty much everything except for one other little nifty deal. That's the batteries. The issue that I've had whenever I've taken even my little plane out to fly is I forget to set the timer on my iPhone, and I invariably wind up panicking and bringing the plane in too early, and you know, it doesn't work. So what I've done is I bought these, you know, where are they? There's these guys. I bought 6 of these guys in a single bag for $11. I don't remember if that included the shipping, but maybe. Now those little guys are very interesting pieces because it's going to be very hard for me to clip this in place at the same time as I'm filming. So you're going to have to take my word for it. But if you take this guy here where you can see the little silver leads, where the leads come out. Sorry about the shaky hands. And they line up with these clips in the back, which are kind of hard to tell, but they go like this. You put the black wire to the left of this little guy, and I'm going to do this kind of off camera, and you're going to hear that it gives out quite a squeal. So here goes. All right, now when I clip it in, I get, come on. Okay, now what it does is it starts to cycle through and it tells you what the charge is on each cell, okay? And 3.8 is just a standard storage shell, storage charge. And it tells you its total is a 15.2 watts. But the really cool thing about this thing is that at the very top of it, there's this little button right up here. And if you pulse through that button, where is it? Press it, it starts counting down. You see that number right there? Now, that's 0. But you can bring it up to a 3 point, in my case, 4, 5, or 6, and that is now the alarm, the default alarm, that once that battery drains down to that level, it'll begin to sound an alarm. And what's cool about that is that it's certainly loud enough that you'll be able to hear it over the motor while the plane is flying in the air. So I have 6 batteries and I have 6 of those little alarm things, and I figure they're going to save my bacon sooner or later. I think I'm hoping that's everything. Anyway, this is coming to you from somebody who has never done this before. And I'm just fresh to RC, so hopefully I haven't committed any terrible faux pas with my description of things, and I hope this helps you through the build process. Again, the builds that you see on YouTube are excellent. You can discard the instructions entirely and just watch those things, except for when it comes to the electronics, the wiring. That takes a certain amount of intuition, because invariably the guys showing you the video don't take you through that process, which is very frustrating for somebody who's never done it. But basically, in the end, it makes sense. The wires that are coming down out of the wings that are the lighting thing, you can tell where they are because they're stuck in the wings. Now, one little fine point, I used some yellow duct tape to wrap the wire against the strut So it doesn't have that ghetto wound around kind of look. When I saw that the first time, I said, you gotta be kidding. Anyway, the yellow duct tape seems to work fantastic, and I'm sure there's a red version of that if you wind up with the red plane, which is also pretty. I love the yellow because I think it's going to really show up in the sky. I'm one of those poor guys who has just a lot of difficulty with orientation, and I really struggle with that. I'm hoping that this bigger plane and it being yellow is going to resolve some of that. Anyway, with luck, I'll post my maiden probably in the next week. And good luck to everybody. And this plane's great, y'all. Don't hold back on it. For $205, including shipping, it's a steal. Later.